All right, welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks. We've been talking about sort of how citizens gather information. We're going to talk today and start a discussion of other kinds of political institutions that kind of help citizens kind of aggregate. Okay, it's hard to put it in better terms. Political parties and interest groups perform a very essential function in democratic politics. They act as what we describe in political science as intermediary institutions. Okay, like the media, their job is to try and help citizens identify their interests and to funnel their participation in meaningful ways. Now, there is a certain amount of manipulation involved in that as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Interestingly, a couple days ago, several congressional Republicans filed a lawsuit, or basically a letter, basically challenging the legitimacy or the right of overseas Americans to vote in the upcoming elections. The argument being that the processes that by which people vote by absentee ballot abroad are not sufficiently checked. There is a law that facilitates the voting, especially of military personnel abroad. But it's important to keep in mind that all Americans abroad have a legal right to vote, and that this challenge is, in jurisprudential terms, is untimely. It's coming within a month of an election, and frankly, there is zero likelihood that it's going to actually be successful in court with any legitimate judge. Because again, it is being challenged within the 60-day rule. You can't challenge basic election law that have been on the books for decades. It's important to keep in mind that soldiers, that people in uniform, have always been viewed as having an absolute right to vote, and any kind of challenge to that is really going to be legally problematical. Now, why are these 6 congressmen, issuing this challenge? I assume because they are fearful that the overseas vote is not going to be favorable to the aspirations of the Republican presidential nominee. Again, I labor to understand why anyone would actually launch that kind of legal challenge. I can't imagine that kind of challenge would be popular with the military, and I suspect it would probably be viewed as profoundly offensive. But there it is, and it really again highlights the extent to which this election is, partisan polarization has created such a zero-sum environment that these folks are leaving no card left unplayed, which again, reflects just how acrimonious our politics has gotten. So what are we learning today? We're going to talk a little bit about political parties, how parties may differ in different partisan systems. Second, we're going to talk about parties and the role they play both in elections and within government. And then third, we're going to talk about party identification and how partisan polarization is increasingly informing voters' choices in the current environment. So what exactly are political parties? It's important to know. I think I used a phrase, a quote from this guy a couple of presentations ago, a gentleman by the name of E.E. Schattschneider, who was a specialist. He was an academic who focused on political parties and interest group behavior. And he basically said that modern democracy is unthinkable save in terms of parties. And what he really meant, again, was that in human communities, When it comes down to deciding what you're going to do, how you're going to govern, basic rules and things like that, people are going to separate out in terms of how they should proceed. In the United States, we have lots and lots of states that are very low tax, but also low service. And people who live there, live in those states for a reason. They don't want to be taxed heavily. They think they can get by on their own resources, and that is their right within a federal system of government. Likewise, some states that are much more populous, have large urban areas, generally have much higher tax rates and also have much higher services. And they, again, also make that kind of choice. Economics in the United States are oftentimes the origin point of kind of partisan differences, okay? So in the United States, parties are really what I would describe as alliances of interests. So political parties are coalitions of people who form a united front to win control of government and implement a platform of policies. In other words, a political party is going to try and identify candidates that they will then, lend the party name to. And a candidate will then say, I am running as a Democrat or Republican because I believe in the values of the Democratic or Republican Party. Now, the Constitution was not actually drafted with political parties in mind. The idea of parties and interest groups find no place in the Constitution. And in fact, George Washington, who presided over the Constitutional Convention and who was our first president, in his farewell address issued what was a warning against the spirit of faction, which he saw forming within his own administration, as John Adams, his vice president, and Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State, were increasingly at odds with one another. And that really reflected what the framers, many of whom were classically educated, they'd studied the Greeks and they'd studied the Romans, that reflected what they feared would happen. That ancient Greek democracy was always riven by factions, which were again oftentimes economic in origin, where you would have wealthy people who were oftentimes members of a nobility, basically at war with what we call the demos, the rest of the community. And so, despite Washington's warning, a very distinctive party system began emerging shortly after ratification. And in fact, the ratification debates helped solidify the early, embryonic formation of political parties, with the Federalists advocating for the ratification of the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists, advocating for more of a decentralized system of government. That would really form the beginnings of a proto-party system, where, again, the Federalists came into government. Those people who supported ratification largely won control of the federal government in those early years of the Republic. And the Anti-Federalists began, competing and winning office, oftentimes in the southern states. And you ended up with, basically, after a period of time, going through Thomas Jefferson really into James Monroe's presidency, without a really clear party system, but where you see the beginnings of a party system kind of coalescing among those folks who had originally been opposed to the Constitution, but gradually made their peace with it and eventually found their way into government. And those folks became the Democratic Republicans in the 1800 election, 12 years after the formation of the Republic. And those folks basically had a clear field until the 1820s. So partisanship reflects this reality that human beings tend to identify with and support parties and or causes. Okay, it's interesting. There's kind of an analogy in sports. Oftentimes we become here in Oklahoma, you tend either to become a Sooner fan or an Oklahoma State fan. God forbid that you become a Texas fan. But that reflects the realities of the communities in which you live. People orient towards one of those two political parties, not necessarily because of the quality of the institutions or the quality of their football teams. God knows Oklahoma State has had a tough row as it comes to football and basketball. They're occasionally very good in baseball. They're pretty good at baseball. But the reality is that, again, it's not success or failure that causes people to identify with one team or another. In fact, a lot of people like rooting for the underdog. And so Americans have tended to group into two parties that are decentralized and that form rather loose coalitions. So as coalitions, American parties do not always march in lockstep on everything. It's important to keep in mind, for much of our history, our political parties were what we call catch-all parties, which is to say they formed oftentimes regionally, but they typically were not organized around any kind of coherent ideology. Okay. In fact, there were typically liberal, moderate, and conservative factions within both political parties. Okay. So democracy kind of requires this sort of organization, this sort of intermediary set of institutions to, again, give people guidance, because people left to their own devices oftentimes don't know what's in their own best interest, and they kind of have to be attracted to certain kinds of basic causes. James Madison was one of the first to really ruminate, and he was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, which, if you'll remember from our early discussions of the Constitution, were very important and formative in winning ratification of the Constitution. They were mostly published in New York City newspapers. James Madison, in Federalist number 10, addressed head-on the problem of faction, the mischief of faction in the 10th of these Federalist Papers. And he pointed out that in a democracy, you're going to have freedom of association. And where people have freedom of association, they are going to be inclined to form naturally into factions. Human beings are sociable. They're going to be able to do these kinds of things. And so faction can create problems in democratic communities. Madison said, really, there's only two ways to manage factions. You can try to abolish them by using the power of the state, or you can try to arrange political institutions in such a way that no one faction is able to win control, durable control of government. He basically says, he dismisses the first remedy, that is a cure worse than the disease. The only way to abolish faction is to create a government so powerful that it would naturally be highly authoritarian. Think about what you would have to do to outlaw factions. You would have to police people's private behavior in highly intrusive ways. Okay? So he basically makes the argument that instead of attempting to ban factions, you should try to create a civil society large enough and complex enough that factions struggle to compete. Okay? And there he made the argument that the size, a large federal republic with separation of powers and federalism would create such a society that would be sufficiently decentralized that factions would have difficulty basically dominating the system. So parties, once they're allowed to, create, once you're allowed to create parties, the natural tendency is to forge alliances across economic class and ethnic groupings. And that is, again, one of the reasons why, it's not like the Democratic Republican Party and the Whigs somehow were factionalized along economic lines. Okay, there were very different groups of people that populated those two parties in those early years of the Republic. One of the things that's happened, though, is that the parties have tended to calcify economic differences and class distinctions. America, for a very long time, lacked the kind of very distinctive classes that characterized British society. That's increasingly less the case. More and more, you're seeing that people are, in fact, dividing along sort of economic class lines. It used to be the Democrats were the party of working class people. Increasingly, non-college educated white working class people are gravitating into the Republican Party for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to try to evaluate here. I'm not saying that that's a good or a bad thing. That's simply one of the things that has happened, that Donald Trump and his time in politics has tended to accelerate. So despite the basic problems with parties, they remain an essential feature of democratic governance. So America has distinctively a two-party system. Now, that doesn't mean that there are only two parties in American politics. We have an American Socialist Party, we have a Green Party, we have a Libertarian Party. But the reality is that in the overwhelming majority of elections that are held both at the federal, state, and local level, the people who are competing, successfully for office is either going to be a member of the Democratic or Republican parties. Okay? And so why do we have a two-party system? Very simply, it's embedded in the rules that are governed by the Constitution. The Constitution mandates single-member districts for elections in the House of Representatives. That established, and though that single-member plurality rule, again, you have single-member districts, and you only have to win the most votes. You don't have to win a clear majority of votes in most general elections. That creates an environment that favors two-party systems. There are several other factors that reinforce that tendency towards two-partyism. And that is also that we have a presidential system of government where the president is elected independently of Congress. Okay, this creates what is known as Duverger's law, which is named after Maurice Duverger, who was a French political scientist, who held that plurality voting with single-member districts are, in almost every instance, going to produce a two-party system. So we routinely see that Americans, when they respond to public opinion surveys, one of the things they say that they would like to see change is we would like to see more options. We would like to see more political parties. If you want to do that, you have to make some fundamental revisions to the Constitution, particularly to Article 1, and revise those portions of the Constitution delegating or dictating the idea of single-member districts. If you could change it to states, where states have multi-member districts, where each state is a district unto itself, it gets as many representatives as the apportionment of Congress allows. Then you would, instead of voting for individuals, you would be voting for the political party. You would be just pulling a lever, either for the Republicans or the Democrats or the Liberal Party or the whatever party that subsequently emerges. Okay? That would be the only way really to get to a multi-party system. And there's questions as to what that would produce. Okay? You may end up with changes that are good, that make polarization less intense, that produces more healthy competition. It would also mean that parties themselves would likely rarely get to the majority, get to control of Congress by themselves. They would have to form coalitions within, with other parties to win control of the House of Representatives or the Senate at any particular point in time. At the same time, those kinds of rules changes might, destabilize our politics in very consequential and disturbing ways. okay? So we have to be careful what we wish for, right? So how political parties form and change, there are typically two avenues of party formation. Avenue one is where societal conflict leads to competing elites, who compete for popular support. Avenue two is where groups outside of government organize popular support to win control of government. Historically, our party system has been highly resistant to Avenue 2. We've generally had party changes as a result of Avenue 1. If you look at the slide, it shows you the evolution of the party system. As I mentioned, the Federalists were the dominant party. In 1788, they controlled government until 1800, and then the Jeffersonian Republicans, also known as the Democratic Republicans, formed in the 1890s. They won control of government in 1800. They were the dominant party until you saw really through the election of 1824. The period from 1816 to 1824, we often describe as the era of good feelings. Our debt had been resolved from the Revolutionary War. The Louisiana Purchase had, provided enormous amounts of land for people to move into. Poverty was at a very low rate. Employment was absolutely full. Nobody that wanted a job lacked for a job. And then you got the election of 1824, which produced the first serious electoral controversy that led to, because nobody won, it ended up being a four-way race. Andrew Jackson actually won the most popular votes and the most electoral college votes, but didn't get to a majority. The House of Representatives subsequently adjudicated the election and gave it to John Quincy Adams. Most people argue that there was a corrupt deal that swung the election, where Henry Clay, who was one of the great masters of American congressional politics in that early era, swung his support behind John Quincy Adams in exchange for a position within the administration. That produced again, the tremendous amount of controversy that led to the creation of the Jacksonian Democratic Party, where, again, Andrew Jackson didn't get mad, he got organized. He went back to the states. He formed alliances with newspaper editors in a lot of these newly formed states. They became the basis of the Democratic Party as we understand it today. By 1832, you get a relatively, really what I would consider to be the first durable party system between Democrats and Whigs, which lasts for, about 25, 30 years. But again, Democrats and Whigs were being destroyed from within over the issue of slavery, because there were slave factions within both the Democratic and Whig parties. And there were subsequently, every time that the Democrats and Whigs made a compromise on slavery, which they did several times over this period, the Missouri Compromise, the Nebraska Compromise, all of these compromises caused defections, which ultimately led to the dissolution of the Whig Party and the formation of the Republican Party. And so Over this period of time, you have seen basically, from 1854 to the present, you have seen the Democrats and the Republicans be the dominant party. So we really have a two-party dominant system. We have other parties. We have had, third parties form at different times, typically in response to certain issues. For example, in the 1880s, you saw again the emergence of the progressive movement, and both Republicans and Democrats had progressive wings within their parties. But they subsequently, again, the Republican Party kind of purged their progressives, and many of those folks moved over to the Democratic Party. Democratic dominance from the 1830s to the 1860s is largely owing to the progressive era movement of progressives into the Democratic Party, and then the subsequent Great Depression, which led to a shift of a few million voters from the Republican to the Democratic Party. It's never large movements of people. It's oftentimes relatively small movements in relatively small numbers of states that can have a decisive impact in electoral politics. These are what we call alignments and realignments of voters. So again, that early party system, you had the election of 1800, the era of good feelings, the corrupt deal of 1824, Andrew Jackson's formation of the Democratic, the Jacksonian Democratic Party and the Whig party system, and then the formation of the grand old party, the Republican Party, which was again a coalition of former Whigs like Abraham Lincoln and Free Soilers, and folks that were basically the anti-Masonic Party, the Know-Nothings. These were people who were deeply, what really was driving them was their hostility to slavery. The Civil War had a profound impact on the two-party system. It gave rise to sectionalism. The contested race of 1860 nevertheless produced a majority president in Abraham Lincoln. He was able to win the Electoral College despite the fact that there were multiple candidates. In fact, what happened was the Whigs basically split the Whigs and the Democrats split their votes. But they were a small minority, and Abraham Lincoln was able to get a majority of states won a majority of states as a result, and became a plurality president. Gradually, of course, that led to the secession of the southern states to form the attempt of the Confederacy, which failed into the crucible of the Civil War because it simply could not defend itself from the attempts by the Union to reassert, to win by war what it couldn't win by elections. I don't say that negatively. Basically, the Confederates seceded. Either the Union had to wage war in order to bring those states back into the Union, and the argument was that the secession was unconstitutional, or they were going to have to simply allow the Confederacy to leave in a fait accompli. So ultimately, the South failed because they simply lacked the manpower to defeat the Union. The Union had a greater industrial base, it had more people, and it was able to gradually smother the Confederacy. The Confederacy was defeated. That led to Reconstruction, and also what many historians these days are describing as the Second Founding. Again, the Civil War amendments created a new constitutional environment where the Southern kind of authoritarianism based on slavery was no longer, constitutional. Okay. Unsurprisingly, this period from 1865 to 1932 was a period of Republican dominance. But again, it was sectional dominance. The Union, those states of the former Union were loyal to the GOP because the Republican Party was the party that successfully prosecuted the Civil War. And in the North, to be a Democrat meant you were largely not from this country. Many of the democratic machines that emerged in this period in northeastern and midwestern states were comprised of immigrants who came to the country kind of in that period after the Civil War. But in the South, again, there were very few Republicans, hardly any after Reconstruction. The Reconstruction, blacks flocked to the Republican Party. Southern blacks flocked to the Republican Party and basically controlled government for periods of time. But immediately after Reconstruction, white Democrats re-seized control of state government and basically disenfranchised black Southerners. We recall this from our discussion of civil rights. And so this was, the rise of sectionalism, where again, you have very little Democratic presence in the northern states, almost no presence of Republicans in the southern states. And again, this was reinforced by the social mores of that day. There was the idea of waving the bloody shirt, where at parades, you would have former, soldiers from the Civil War. In the South, it would be former Confederate soldiers, and in the North, it would be former Union soldiers. And they would be, family members would display the shirts bloodied by people who had been killed and maimed in the war as a remembrance of just how horrible that war was and how hardened feelings were against the other section of the country. So we didn't just, we didn't just fight a war and then, embrace one another. We went through a long period of real alienation, which had a profound cultural impact. In the latter part of the 19th century, a lot of, what we call the Americana music, "This Land Is Your Land," all the great patriotic songs emerged in this period as an effort to bring the United States, back into something closer to unity. So it's important to keep in mind, the United States spent a good long period of time in a period of real mutual antagonism. And that, kind of sets the stage for the cultural conflicts that we are dealing with today. The modern Democratic and Republican parties, again, the Civil War was a crucible that shaped the political parties for more than a half a century. The Great Depression fundamentally shaped the political parties that we understand today. The Great Depression ended Republican dominance and ushered in what became known as the New Deal era, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt was basically making the argument, I'm going to give a new deal to the forgotten man. The Great Depression has crushed, Republican policies that helped produce the Great Depression has crushed the American worker. We're going to make things better for them. The Democratic Party enjoyed a period of dominance from 1932 to 1966 and fundamentally led to the creation of the modern administrative state and many of the elements of the modern welfare state. Okay? So the three critical issues that broke up the New Deal coalition were first, civil rights, because that alienated Southern whites and kind of led to their slow exit from the Democratic Party. Environmental policies, which produced a lot of environmental regulation that alienated American manufacturers. And then the Vietnam War, which produced the anti-war movement and that provided enormous divisiveness. It introduced an element of divisiveness into American culture that, again, politicians were able to exploit for their advantage. Nixon's Southern strategy fundamentally helped broaden the Republican Party's base in the late 1960s and the 1970s by appealing to white Southerners. With the eventual defection of white Southerners to the Republican Party in the 1960s, the electoral strength of the New Deal coalition lost much of its vitality, lost its control of the Solid South, for example. And the Democratic Party struggled to win elections in the latter half of the 20th century from 1968 to 2004. You really only saw, again, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton winning elections in those periods. Similarly, you really only saw from 1932 to 1968, you really only saw Eisenhower winning elections as a Republican for the presidency. Okay? So the golden era for the Republican Party was that era of Reaganism, which lasted from 1981 to 1989. The two issues that drove the Reagan coalition were deregulation and tax cuts. And a big part of the Reagan, kind of revolution was this idea of devolution, which we discussed in our presentations on federalism. Reagan won over a critical element of what had previously been the New Deal coalition, which were working class ethnic whites in many urban areas in the Northeast and the Midwest. So what were the political effects of the devolution revolution? In one sense, Reagan succeeded in that he was able to govern for 2 terms, and he was able to make the case that government is not the solution to every problem, government is the problem. Government, Ronald Reaganism really influenced and shaped the nature of debates over government from the mid-1980s well into the 21st century. Okay? Eventually, and again, the argument of when you talk about Democratic dominance during the early part of the 20th century into the middle part of the 20th century, or Reagan's dominance in the latter part, the Reaganism dominance in the latter part of the 20th century, it doesn't mean that Democrats won all the arguments in the 20th century and that Reagan won all the arguments. It means that they won most of them. And they were sufficiently influential that they influenced the shape and the scope of government. And so in the 2000s, with the administration of George Bush, especially with the controversies over the prosecution of the Iraq War and then the subprime mortgage meltdown, you see the emergence of what becomes known as the Obama coalition. And again, this reflects fundamentally the coming to fruition of what had previously been the McGovern coalition, the coalition in 1972 that led Democrats to one of the most historic defeats in American electoral politics. McGovern had hoped to forge a coalition of young Americans, liberals, and minority voters. That election in 1972 was a disaster for Democrats. They lost, I believe, every state except maybe for Massachusetts. I think he got barely over 40% of the popular vote. In 1972, that was, again, it's interesting, the two of the biggest, electoral victories, Johnson's victory in 1964 and Nixon's victory in 1972, were very short in terms of their enjoyment of these dominant wins. Within a couple of years, by 1974, Democrats won one of the largest midterm election victories in history. In 1966, Republicans won back seats that they had not won in decades and basically got back into a competitive position in electoral politics. So the Obama coalition was, again, this grouping that was a tiny minority in 1972. It had no realistic way of becoming a majority of the American electorate. Remember, in 1972, the American electorate had a much smaller proportion of college-educated voters. It had a much smaller proportion of Black and Hispanic and Asian American voters. The Obama coalition took that coalition and reckoned with demographic change. Obama was a uniquely compelling historical figure. He was a galvanizing speaker. He was also a very pragmatic, cautious politician. Much like the success of Reaganism lay in the kind of the genial nature of Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama's success lay in the fact that he was in a position to be the first Black president, the first Black male president, and he didn't want to have that historic achievement destroyed by scandals. And so he was highly cautious. His personal rectitude has never been brought into question. He was an enormously prudential president. The signal achievement, the Affordable Care Act, was something that was a nearly consensus issue. The Affordable Care Act was one of the most conservative accommodations that would have profound change on Americans' access to health care, but with the least kind of demand that government be playing a role. It recognized the complications of federalism. It kind of worked with the states to create their own healthcare systems. So unlike, for example, Medicare, which is one of the big achievements of the 1960s Great Society program of Lyndon Johnson, that was a national program. That was a top-down. That program, I tell people, Medicare is probably the closest thing to socialism in American government. And people automatically, a lot of the conservatives that I tell that, get mad because they like Medicare. Okay, and they want to get Medicare when it's their time. It's ironic, that again, the Democrats' success in the Obama years produced the Tea Party, which is an acronym for taxed enough already, which again was another tax revolt, but there was a tax revolt in the 1970s which prefaced the rise of Ronald Reagan. And, in no small terms, the rise of the Tea Party radicalized the Republican Party, which was already sort of a reactionary party. An oftentimes unspoken aspect of Ronald Reagan's, vision of the Republican Party was an unwinding of much of the New Deal and the Great Society. They wanted to go back to a simpler time in government. Donald Trump did the same thing, and he basically was able to execute a hostile takeover over an increasingly radicalized Republican Party. And he rode to prominence on birtherism, which was this thing that came out in Barack Obama's first term, where people were challenging his eligibility to be President of the United States, claiming that he was not born in the United States. This is where you begin to see a lot of misinformation introduced into American politics. Because again, Barack Obama was the first black president. He was really a biracial president, born to a white mother and a Kenyan father. There were certain people who tried to use very convoluted legal legerdemain to say that because he was born in Hawaii and because his father was not an American citizen, that he was not an American citizen. Hawaii was a state when he was born. Regardless of that, it was still a territory, and under the 14th Amendment, he is a citizen. He is a natural-born citizen. These arguments were grating on Obama. Donald Trump was constantly challenging him to produce his long-form birth certificate. He claimed he had sent investigators to Hawaii, and you wouldn't believe, he was telling people on TV, you wouldn't believe what we're discovering. Well, guess what? We didn't discover anything. It was all a smokescreen. Barack Obama is a natural-born citizen. Okay? But that is one of the origin points of a lot of the sort of just how much this smoke has gotten into our politics. I was going to use a different word, but I edited myself. So party polarization in Congress has, again, part of the problem is that you have seen the erosion of deal makers in Congress. It's very hard as a moderate, as someone who can reach across both the Republicans and Democrats and make deals and form coalitions. It's hard as a deal maker to win elections in American politics, in American congressional politics these days, because of the problem of gerrymandering, which is something that we'll talk about in our next presentations when we get to Congress. Gerrymandering creates a problem because it tends to pack people into districts in such a way. If you look at this map here, this is from 2012 in North Carolina. This is how Republicans were able to win, 1, 2, 3, all but 3 of the districts of the 13 districts in North Carolina. That is by packing black and urban voters in the Research Triangle and in Charlotte into very small, compact districts, and then divide, create as many conservative, districts where Republicans are a majority of the vote in as many districts as possible. That produces, again, a partisan environment where if all you have to do is appeal to partisan voters, you're going to be more partisan yourself. You can see it in elections where people who have to appeal, where they know their district is 50-50 and they have to, find a way to seek the median voter, they are generally going to be more moderate in terms of how they express themselves politically. And so gerrymandering is a serious problem in terms of why it produces partisan polarization. There is also the reality of self-sorting, and that is that people who are liberal naturally tend to gravitate towards larger, more urban parts of the country, whereas people who are more conservative naturally tend to gravitate towards more rural and suburban parts of the country. And again, that feeds this sense of polarization in our politics. Parties in elections and government, okay? So again, I've made this argument that political parties are intermediary institutions. So how do parties go about competing to win in elections? Both American parties have largely ceded the recruitment of candidates to primary elections. So people self-select. They decide they're going to run for office. They either find independent sources of funding or they are independently wealthy, a phenomenon that again is affecting our politics, where more and more elites, especially economic elites, are self-recruiting and funding their own elections. That has produced a radically decentralized two-party system, where again, we don't really have two parties. We have two national party sets of institutions, and then we have 50 state parties that are again of very varying quality and health. The Democratic Party here in Oklahoma is really weak because again, they don't have reliable sources of funding. And they are simply struggling to identify candidates that can compete with Republicans. So the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee's job is to minimize conflict and do whatever they can to ensure a unified party going into each election cycle. Both parties extensively make use of political action committees, otherwise known as PACs, to raise money and build the party's infrastructure. The fact that there are so many PACs out there raising money further fragments our political parties. So our parties are weak, okay? And that is not necessarily a good thing for our government, for how our government works. So how do parties go about controlling government? Parties, again, they compete in elections. When they win the most seats in Congress, when they win control of the presidency, they are part of the majority. The party that is out of power forms the minority. Both the House and Senate leadership wield distinctive powers. The House leaders, the Speaker of the House and the House Majority leaders, are more powerful institutionally within their institutions than the Senate leadership, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. But speakers are only as powerful as their hold over the majority of their party. And one of the things we have seen since Republicans gained control of the House of Representatives in 2022 is a highly fractious Republican-controlled House, where very little is getting done. First you had, what was his name? Kevin. You had Kevin McCarthy from California, who became Speaker after the 2022 elections, where he struggled to form the speakership. He had to go through more than a dozen votes. That is very rare in leadership elections in the House of Representatives. But, nevertheless, he became he had to make lots and lots of promises to some of the most conservative members of his body. That really affected his ability to control the House. And then eventually he got booted. He had one of the shortest speakerships in American legislative history. And that led to the election of Mike Johnson as sort of a compromise candidate. And he likewise has struggled to maintain control over the House conference and to actually govern. They put numerous pieces of legislation together that they couldn't even get majorities of their own party to support. They struggled mightily. When they have gotten things passed, it's largely because he's had to rely on Democratic votes to secure things like funding for Ukraine in their war against Russia. So another important aspect of party control of Congress is the committee system. Now, Woodrow Wilson, once famously said that parties in general, or Congress in general session is Congress on display, whilst Congress in its committee rooms is Congress at work. And what he meant by that was both houses of Congress do most of their work through committees. And the majority party exerts their will over the legislative process through their control of committees. And so in each of the committees, and we'll talk more about the committee system in a couple of weeks, but in each of the committees, the party that's in the majority has more members than the minority party. So that basically means that so long as the members, the party members on the committee stay together, they can generally get things through, through the committee process. Now, it's a different process in the Senate because in the Senate, the minority party has some ability to bollocks up whatever it is that the majority party is trying to do through a parliamentary tactic known as the filibuster, which again we'll discuss later. That typically means that the majority does not exert the same level of control in the Senate as the majority party enjoys in the House. Parties and policies. There's often this complaint that there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Republican and Democratic parties. Since the 1980s, the ideological distinctions between the parties have grown more and more stark to the point where, again, this idea that there's no difference between the two parties really, it doesn't make any sense, okay? That reflected really the idea that there wasn't any difference between the parties, reflected again this idea that our party system remained, it remained guided towards the center, towards deal makers, okay? And so partisan polarization, and especially negative partisanship, this idea that voters don't vote for their party because they love their party, they vote for their party because they hate the other party. That has created, again, an increasingly wide divergence between the Republican and Democratic parties' preferences. And that has oftentimes led to this yin and yang where whenever, control of Congress, where both the presidency and Congress are controlled by one party, they get busy trying to undo whatever it is that the party had done previously. Okay? This is, one of the great failures of Donald Trump was that he spent more than a year attempting to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, which was the Obama administration's signal achievement. He ultimately failed in that because, again, they failed in the Senate because it came down to one vote. It came down to the vote of John McCain of Arizona, who had been treated for cancer. He would die within a year of this vote. But he came into the Senate chamber to cast a vote on a a bill that would have effectively gotten rid of the Affordable Care Act, and he famously did the thumbs down and said no. And he said no in part because he didn't like the bill, first and foremost because it didn't really substantially reform the healthcare system. Again, just getting rid of the Affordable Care Act was going to create horrible problems for our healthcare system, because what had existed prior to the Affordable Care Act really didn't exist anymore. It would have given the insurance companies basically a free run to do whatever they wanted in terms of healthcare policy and in terms of how they created health insurance. And so basically McCain's negative vote on that meant that Trump failed in the one big thing that he tried to do. Of course, he also cut taxes. That was the one consensus thing that Republicans could agree on. I would also note that I think in part, I believe that John McCain voted against the repeal of the Affordable Care Act out of a sense of personal animosity towards Donald Trump. He knew that Trump failing in that would hurt him. And I really believe that John McCain had reached the conclusion by 2017 that Donald Trump was unfit for office. So what are the basic partisan differences between Democrats and Republicans? Again, on this slide you can see Democrats want to expand funding for public education and social services. They want some kind of national health insurance system. They want increased regulation of business to address climate change. They want to raise taxes on corporations and the wealthy to reduce income inequality. They want restrictions on gun rights. They support consumer protection programs. They support legalized abortion and protections of civil rights for minorities. Republicans want to reduce spending on social welfare and health care. They want to cut taxes on corporations and the wealthy. They want to protect the rights of gun owners. They want to reduce immigration. They want to increase military spending. They want to preserve family values, okay? The differences are pretty stark, okay? When you go through the list, if you see that one party supports something and one party opposes something that you actually believe in, that has an effect on your support for that party, unless you're in such unless you are so motivated by tribalism that you don't care about issues. You only care about your tribe. So this slide is really interesting and kind of again illustrates the differences between party systems, right? The blue is bad, right? That reflects what we call one-partyism. And that is a situation where one party is dominant and usually maintains control by authoritarian means. Green is basically something like totalitarianism, like the Chinese Communist Party enjoys. You also have two-party systems. There aren't many of them, right? If you look, basically it's United States, Australia, a handful of African states. Multi-party systems prevail in Europe. They prevail in Latin America. They prevail in Mexico and Canada. They prevail in India, in Mongolia, in many of the Central Asian republics. And why is that? Why do multi-parties generally tend to prevail? And the answer is that multi-party systems are generally strongly correlated with parliamentary systems of government. And what is a parliamentary system of government? That is where, kind of England is considered to be the mother of the parliamentary system. And that is a situation where the parliament is the dominant institution of government, and where to the extent that there is an executive, the executive emerges out of parliament, okay? So in the United Kingdom, which is, again, this template. You vote, as a voter, you vote for a party. You vote for Labour, you vote for the Tories, you vote for the Liberals, you vote for UKIP. there are typically, four parties, two of whom are relatively minor, rarely get more than teens of the vote. Whichever of the stronger parties wins the majority in the House of Commons, that party then forms the government. The leader of, right now the leader of Labor, whose name escapes me, is now the prime minister. Okay, because in an internal election, that person was selected as the leader of Labor. In parliamentary elections recently, Labor won partly in part because Tory, the conservatives, have really mismanaged, government over the past, probably 8 years. And so they had a good long run of control, probably, I think, since, Tony Blair. But ultimately, they kind of ran out of steam, and now Labor is in a position to manage the government. And so, again, what happens is the leader of the party then migrates over to 10 Downing Street, which is right across the street from Parliament, and that person then becomes the prime minister of the country. And so, parliamentary systems. It's also interesting, and we may talk more about this shortly in another presentation. But there's a reason why we have never had a woman president. Presidential systems make it much more difficult for women to win the top executive position. Parliamentary systems, again, it's part of the internal party dynamics. It's not an accident that there are African countries that have, where women have won, control of, won their party's top position of prime minister. And, it will be a first if in 19 or 18 days now, or no, 17 days now, 20 days now. If in less than 3 weeks, you end up with Kamala Harris winning the presidency. She would be the first woman president in the history of the United States. She would be the first black woman elected president. She would be the first Indian American elected president. The first Southern Asian to be elected president of the United States. There'd be a lot of firsts associated with Kamala Harris in the event that she is successful in her presidential run. Party identification and polarization guide voters. Again, we need to understand the reasons for why people identify with one party over another. And again, what are the sources of polarization? So party identification, again, that reflects individuals' psychological ties to one party or another. Oftentimes you have this idea of retrospective voting, which means that voters are either rewarding or punishing incumbents based on their performance. Okay? There is an emotional component to this partisan attachment, which largely explains how Republicans have in many instances shifted in a polar opposite direction from Reagan's time to the present on an issue, for example, like free trade. Reaganism, one of the foundational points of Reaganism was the idea of a commitment to free trade, to no tariff barriers, and to the maximum amount of free trade. That has really, disappeared. The Republican Party of Donald Trump is a party of protectionism, of trade wars. Again, if you look at the slide, you see, the extent to which, partisan identification is, in many ways, again, Americans are on average moderate to conservative, but over a third of Democrats, over a third of Americans identify as Democrats, and some of them are actually pretty conservative. We're seeing a realignment right now where you're seeing former Republicans like Liz Cheney, who again, she's the daughter of Richard Cheney, the vice president of the Bush years, who had been a Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush. A very conservative guy from a very conservative state who is basically saying, I can't be a Republican anymore. I'm supporting Kamala Harris. There are rumors that Liz Cheney is being considered for a cabinet level position within the Harris administration in the event that she wins. Large majorities of people who served in the Trump administration are now defecting. And again, what this reflects too is there's a growing number of people who are now registered as independent. Now, some of them register for independent for reasons like myself. I am a registered independent because I am a political scientist, and I am supposed to be kind of, impartial as it relates to the study of political phenomena. And so I am registered as an independent. Nevertheless, I think you could probably guess that I do believe in government, and that inclines me in a direction to support one party over the other in a significant percentage of instances. Party activists form the core of political parties. They contribute time, energy, and effort to support their party. Generally, party activists are less moderate and more ideological than the median party member or average Americans. Activists are disproportionately represented in primary elections, and party activists are generally the ones that, a fraction of whom end up at the party's national conventions. And the Democratic Party activists that go to the party conventions and participate in primary elections are, on average, they're more often, people of color. They're more often, very liberal. They're oftentimes disproportionately, women, and again, certain minority groups. They're also affluent. Okay, people who can make it to the party conventions are people who can afford to take, a considerable portion of their days, of their work lives, and go, to Chicago, go to a major city, pay, to attend a convention. Republican, people, on average tend to be older. They tend to be much whiter. If you, were watching Donald Trump's Republican convention, yes, they had some black folks. They had some minorities. They were a minority of the people in the convention hall. That's just the reality. The Republican Party is increasingly a male-dominated, older, very affluent, very white political party. And they have worked to change that appearance, but they have done nothing to change their appeals. Okay? Many wealthy partisan activists wield disproportionate influence through campaign donations and super PAC contributions. And of course, now you have the reality that the owner of one of the major social media platforms, Elon Musk, has turned X and is using X to Donald Trump's advantage. He is using his ownership of X, which used to be Twitter, to work to secure the election of Donald Trump. He has dedicated large sums of money to winning Donald Trump the election. He is again turning his social media site into a platform favoring one party's member. One party's nominee. Republicans would say, well, so what? The mainstream media do the same thing. But the mainstream media are making an attempt at being objective. Donald Trump can rail about ABC News and say that they should have their license revoked, but they were making an attempt at providing an impartial platform at the at the presidential debates, and likewise, at the vice presidential debates hosted, was it by CBS? Again, the parties are making, the networks are trying to hew to the basic tenets of journalism, of professional journalism. Elon Musk is not, right? So that's a real concern that you have a billionaire who may, in recent days, become a trillionaire who is attempting to put his thumb on the electoral scale in favor of one candidate. Now, I guess if you're a Republican, you think that's perfectly fine. But I bet you wouldn't think it was fine if Mark Zuckerberg got off the sideline and said, I'm going to commit $1 billion to getting Kamala Harris elected. This kind of polarization is not healthy to our system because the major social media platforms, going back to our discussion from last week, they really need to be impartial platforms through which campaigns are held. They should not be propaganda outfits. Party identification today, again, if you look at it, the independents are closing in on 40% of the electorate as of 2022. Democrats and Republicans are, below 30%. This is a phenomenon we've found for quite some time at the state level. In Massachusetts, there are more independent voters than there are either Republicans or Democrats. Again, the question is, are they really independent, right? In Massachusetts, you have to suspect that a lot of those independent voters are pretty consistently voting for Democrats in federal elections and are typically supporting Democrats in state legislative elections. They will occasionally elect a moderate like Mitt Romney or Charlie Baker to be their governor, right? So again, this rise of independent voters gives, oftentimes political scientists talk about the myth of independence, which is, again, it reflects that idea that even people who are registered as independent, their sympathies are oftentimes with one party or the other, and they will, in more than 70% of the instances, support one party over the other. So roughly the same percentage of Americans self-identify as Democrats and Republicans. Where they're distributed, again, there's more registered Republicans than Democrats here in Oklahoma by a pretty considerable number. Again, those independents, which is a much smaller number than you'd find, for example, in Massachusetts, but they tend to trend in a Republican direction. So partisanship is distributed unevenly among the states, which leads to the very disturbing phenomenon that in a majority of the states, what you don't have is a two-party system, but a one-party dominant system, where the one party really doesn't have a lot to fear from the minority party. Republicans are not worried about Democrats beating them in general elections. They're worried about incumbents are worried about Republicans challenging them in primary elections. Okay? So that is producing, what's the problem with one-partyism? It leads to authoritarianism. It leads to corruption. The correlation between authoritarianism and corruption is almost, one-to-one. Okay? Authoritarian states almost inevitably become more and more corrupt because they become more worried about supporting the dominant group that provides their campaign funding than they do, the state as a whole. And this is a problem both in Republican dominant states and in Democratic dominant states. 2/3 of our states are one-party dominant states. That creates a real problem. And part of the problem, again, is you have the ideological homogenization of the Democratic and Republican parties. The Democratic Party is increasingly a moderate to liberal party. The Republican Party is increasingly a moderate to conservative party. And that is creating an environment where there's very little compromise possible between the two parties, with the exception of real profound political emergencies, right? When you think about the subprime mortgage meltdown, when you think about COVID, those were instances where both parties recognized that if they take the blame for it, they're going to take an enormous and lasting hit for it. And so they want to avoid at all costs those kinds of problems. Funding for Ukraine is increasingly controversial because, again, the head of the Republican Party is saying, Ukraine needs to settle. They need to settle for the loss of territory. I could end this with one phone call. And yet, a significant, percentage of Republican elected officials continue to support for Ukraine because they know that Russia succeeding in a land grab is going to be bad for American strategic interests because Russia will not stop at the Ukraine. All right, that's all I have for today. When we come back, we will continue our discussion of political parties and interest groups and the essential role and the increasingly problematical role they play in American politics. I'll see you next time.